It's my pleasure to introduce you to Tara Posinelli, who will take over from here.
Hello, everybody. I'm trying to just adjust this so I'm not yelling into your ears. I'm Tara Neely, and I'm a shareholder in the St. Louis office of Posinelli, which is a law firm that has offices around the country. And one of the departments that we have is the IP department. And it consists of a lot of patent attorneys, patent scientists, and patent agents. Many of us have graduate level degrees in a particular area. Some of you may be familiar with the fact that if you want to be a patent attorney, you have to have a technical degree. So I'm assuming most of you in the room, if you wanted to, you could aspire to become a patent attorney or a patent agent. I'm going to start a clock here, so I just kind of keep some time. I'm going to talk to you today about, okay, this is, how about that? Just at a high level, what goes into developing an IP strategy. And I would definitely encourage you to ask me questions, because I think this is an area that's in some ways a little bit esoteric, but you hear a lot about patents. And so I think there might be a lot of perhaps misinformation out there. So I'd definitely encourage you to just ask me questions as we go along. How many people here have seen a patent? Do you know what it looks like? You kind of have a sense of what it looks like. It's a document that captures legal rights, kind of analogous to a deed of real property. So when we're talking about real estate, you have a deed. When you're talking about intellectual property, it's not a plot of land. It exists in the mind. It's intangible. And so a patent is one form of intellectual property. It's a registered form of intellectual property. And when you look at a patent, it's got different sections. And at the very end, you'll see a set of numbered, oftentimes look like paragraphs, but they're actually claims. And the claims are analogous to the metes and bounds in the deed of real property. They kind of give you, they define what the invention is that the patentee is claiming rights to. So I'll get into that a little bit more, but I might need some technical help, again, with advancing. Oh, maybe just right here. There we go. Oops. Go back one. Okay. It's intellectual property. Creations covers property that exists arising from creations of the mind. It covers inventions, literary and artistic works, and symbols, names, images, and designs used in commerce. And there are other forms aside from patents, of course, that cover intellectual property. And any of these devices, these tools, cover the legal rights that are attached to these products of the mind. I'm going to be focusing a little bit on patents today because that's the most relevant, I think, for you all. But trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets are other tools that we use in the business. A patent is a right to exclude others from practicing, using, selling the invention, the patented invention, but it's not actually a right to use it. It's possible that somebody else has something that we call a dominating patent. You might need to be using something that's patented by somebody else in the practice of your invention, and you may need to deal with them, the other patentee, in terms of actually practicing your invention. But you do have the right to keep others from practicing your invention no matter what. It's a 20-year term from the earliest filing date of your invention, the application that covers the invention. And really what a patent is the result of a transaction with the government, and it's whatever government you're talking about that is issuing the patent. A patent is by country, it goes by country. So there are, of course, US patents. There are something actually called a European patent, which is at a high level regional, and then it breaks down through a particular kind of process into the different countries in Europe. Australian patents, Canadian patents, Mexican patents. that they arise from essentially a deal with the government whereby you as the patentee are bringing forward your disclosure for everybody to eventually use, but in exchange for your disclosure for the common good, you get a limited monopoly on your invention, limited in time. So you get to keep everybody else from using it for a certain amount of time, and then at the end of the patent term, it goes into the patent domain. So one thing to think about in terms of patenting strategy is this something that you would like to strike that deal? There are sometimes inventions that you might want to just keep to yourself because you would like to keep it for longer than the 20-year patent term. An example would be something like a secret sauce or secret formula, something like the Coca-Cola formula, for example, has been proprietary for many, many years, much longer than any patent on the formula would have lasted. So sometimes there are things that they're very helpful to you. They might certainly pass the patentability test that we're going to talk about, but you might not want to do that. You might want to keep it for yourself if you think that there's a good chance that it's something that would be suitable for that kind of protection that we would call a trade secret protection. So patentable inventions include, what is patentable? What do I mean when I say patentable? There are kind of different levels when we talk about patentable. And at high level, we're talking about categories of things or inventions that can be patented. And that would include apparatus and devices. I think that might be an area of particular interest to this group, but also compositions of matter, drug compounds, formulations, also methods and processes for making and using, making something or using something. A good example of a patentable use would be use of a drug compound in a particular kind of treatment for example, a disease or a disorder. Various computerized systems, some computerized methods, and ornamental designs are covered in a separate category of patent called design patents, and that would be not of perhaps particular interest to you all, but for example, Nike is a heavy user of design patents. A lot of pet food companies are heavy users of design patents. They actually get patents on the design of their dog bone treats or on the appearance, just the ornamental appearance of a shoe. So that would be covered by something separate called a design patent. What is not patentable, and this will go by country, depending on what country you're in. But in the US, which of course is a major market and a primary interest to us, are things that you would call abstract ideas or laws of nature. For example, E equals MC squared. Any kind of basic algorithm in isolation is not patentable. You have to have some sort of concrete effect or result or operation, or it has to be embodied in something concrete like an apparatus or device. You can't just patent a law of nature. And in my area, which is in biotechnology, we run up against this very often in that inventors will discover some new pathway or some new effect in the body. And that in isolation is not patentable. Things that are, just strictly speaking, noticing a correlation between biomarkers and a certain disease condition, that in itself is not patentable. Biomarker patent applications are very tough to frame in a way that gets past the basic patentability eligibility. Other things that are not patentable are things that are just naturally occurring, like peptides, proteins, molecules that just occur in the body, even if they haven't been discovered yet and they're just being elucidated. They're not patentable in isolation. Nucleic acids that occur naturally are not patentable. However, when you have modified proteins, peptides, or synthetic nucleic acids. They really requires only a very minimal modification for it to become eligible for patenting. So shifting to what a patent looks like, we mentioned this earlier. It's a document that it issues once you have gone through the examination process. And we can talk about that in a little bit. But what you have is this document that has a description of the invention in as complete terms as you can possibly muster at the time you're filing your patent application. It has an abstract. It will often have drawings, although the drawings are not required. And then I mentioned earlier the claims, which are essentially the metes and bounds of the invention and define what your patent rates are. Okay. Go. One more time. Okay. There we go. Okay, so in the U.S., this kind of the way patent applications get examined is very similar, although not exactly the same across countries. And what we have in the U.S. is what I have on the slide are just kind of shorthand for the different standards that you have to meet in order for your claims to be patentable. And the big ones that we concentrate on are novelty and non-obviousness. But there are a couple of others. It has to satisfy some basic requirement for it being useful. In general, that is a very low bar to pass. There are definitely nuances to that I can get into later if you want. But the other one besides novelty and non-obviousness is sufficiency of disclosure, which is a standard. If you hearken back to what I said about this being a transaction with the government where you're trading information for a limited monopoly, there's got to be some requirement that you provide a disclosure that is sufficient to earn you those rights. So the examiners will evaluate your patent application based on just how complete and how comprehensive is your application. Did you give us enough information to support the claims that you are making? If you take one thing away from this talk today, I've worked with a number of students at the undergraduate and graduate level and postdoc level, and many of them have potentially patentable inventions, and what you don't want to do is publicly disclose that invention to anyone before you have the chance to evaluate and decide whether you want to file a patent application. And that public disclosure can happen in a lot of ways that people might not necessarily think of as being a public disclosure that could cause issues for you later on. It could be in a seminar, some kind of poster presentation, trade show. You can avoid that being an issue in terms of disclosure if you have a signed confidentiality agreement. And in the US, you actually do have sort of a grace period if it's your own invention and you have disclosed it publicly, for example, in a seminar or at a poster session or something like that. You have 1 year to file a patent application in the US and you're still okay as far as your own disclosure goes. If somebody else happens to come along and file an application between the time that you publicly disclosed and the time that you file your patent application, you're out of luck, because now in the US we are a first to file system. That's a relatively recent change. But if nobody else has disclosed it as far as you know, and you somehow you didn't think about it, or somebody didn't tell you, you weren't supposed to disclose it without filing your patent application first, you still have a year in the US. For everywhere else, you're just plumb out of luck. So you don't want to do any kind of publishing, whether it's, or public disclosure, whether it's publishing in print or in a poster session or some sort of a talk where you're talking about it. An offer for sale to sell the invention for commercial gain is also falls within this category, and distributing samples or advertising, that kind of thing. Or openly testing, especially with consumers, that would also fall into that category. And you don't want to do that because you don't want to avoid unnecessary loss of patent rights in the US because of your public disclosure. So has anybody here been involved with the patenting process? Good. Okay, so, all right, well, you may have experienced a level of frustration that very few people. I was talking with some clients the other day, and we were talking about how they had done some work with some other patent attorneys, and we were talking about how it can be an incredibly frustrating process because the patent office, especially at the USPTO, is overworked, and they don't have a lot of time to understand your patent application, and they try and move it very forward, very fast, using the sort of very superficial keyword searches for prior art. And prior art would be the references that they're looking at what's out there in the public already to evaluate, do you have something that's new and not obvious over what's already out there? So they did do their own search and evaluate your claims against the prior art. And they often make that first round of search and examination in a very superficial way and turn up art that is, you look at it and go, well, this doesn't have anything to do with my invention. And it can be, sometimes you can get a really recalcitrant examiner where it takes numerous phone calls and cajoling and interviewing to get them to understand things. So anyway, a typical timeline, this isn't necessarily the only kind of timeline, but you would usually in our area, biotechnology and medical devices and that kind of thing, you often file a provisional application. And that is first, and that gives you a year before you actually file the kind of application, a non-provisional application that is going to actually start the examination timeline in the patent office. That provisional application, if you can, will just basically a place marker. And it sits in the patent office, and it will never see the light of day unless and until you file a non-provisional application that claims priority to it. And the good thing about doing it that way, and especially in our area where development can take some time and demonstrating how it works, particularly in actual people, is that it gives you a little bit of time on the front end in terms of fully fleshing out your application. And then it doesn't take away from the term of your patent, which is 20 years from when you file your non-provisional application, not when you file your provisional application. So you get that little extra time at the front end. There are some nuances to that, some limits to that, but you file a provisional application, you file, a year later you file your non-provisional, and then about 2 years after you file your non-provisional application is when you'll get your first substantive exam back from the patent office. And then there's a period of about 2 to 4 years. Again, it depends on the complexity. It depends on what sort of prior art is being turned up. Period of negotiation with the examiner over the claims. And that's called the patent prosecution period. And then the claims are either allowed by a notice of allowance or finally rejected, and then you have to go to an appeal process or abandon it. Or you can actually restart by filing the application again, paying another application fee, and trying to get another round of examination with the examiner. And you can also file what we call continuation or divisional applications during that time period. So when we're talking about patent strategy, there are a lot of things that go into that. It's a kind of a tough thing to summarize briefly, but you definitely want to be thinking in terms of the claims and how they cover what your current commercial plans are for we call it commercial embodiment. Let's say you have a device. How are the claims, how well do they line up against what you think is actually going to be the thing that you are going to be marketing? And then beyond that, how well do the claims go beyond slight changes to that, some slight changes that your competitors might have in mind to work around your patent claims? How broad how broad can you make your claims go? How far can you stretch them? How far can you go to make sure you're trying to capture the obvious moves that a competitor might make? Budget is a big thing. Getting a patent is expensive. It's going to be at least about $10,000 to prepare and file the application to start with, and then it's going to probably be another 10, 20, could be more to conduct the prosecution with the negotiation with the patent office and get your claims. So just in terms of number of patent applications, can become a really big deal, especially for a small company. And then if you're a big company and you have an extensive budget, you might take the strategy of, I'm going to throw everything up on the wall and see what sticks. If you have the money, you can do that. But so budget is a big piece of it. You want to be thinking in terms of your geographic plans. Is this something that you're going to be doing just in the U.S. And worry only about your protection in the U.S., or do you want to move into other markets? And typically, even for our smaller clients, they're very interested in coverage in Europe, particularly, and also frequently in Canada, Australia, and increasingly areas in countries in Asia, Japan, South Korea, even increasingly China and Singapore. So most of those places have very similar, very comparable examination systems where all the countries have been working towards kind of an alignment over the past few decades, but they do differ. So you have different strategies in each of those, but you can use what you're doing in one country and information that you've gleaned from the prosecution in one country to inform your prosecution in the other country, because they're certainly not going in lockstep. Let's see. Okay. Investors and buyers in a company, or for that matter, in the rights of your invention or inventions, are going to want to know where you stand in terms of your regulatory approval plans. What is your strategy? What kind of approvals are you going to need before you can market? And what are your prospects? And in general, the market potential. And they are going to want to know your IP position and how that lines up also with your regulatory plans, which you'll be hearing more about from Dawn shortly. But from the IP point of view, they're going to want to know, first of all, are we good on the ownership? Do you have documentation of who were the actual inventors here, and what is their relationship to the entity that is offering the rights? Because what often happens is it's not the inventor per se that is offering the rights to an invention. It is an entity that the inventor has assigned their rights to, a small company, an LLC. Sometimes it can be a university, particularly if you're a grad student. So they want to establish that the inventorship is proper and that there's the proper line of chain of title from the inventors to whoever is offering the invention rights. Are there any encumbrances? Just as the way if you were in real estate, you'd be checking to see the chain of title. Is it free of anybody else's claims, any liens or anything like that, any security interests? And then they're going to look at the scope and strength of the claims. Again, we're back to the claims in the document itself. They're going to just, again, the way somebody looking at a real estate deed would go out and do a survey of the land. You're going to do a survey of the claims and what is already what the prior art is out there, and were these patent claims, were they adequately, properly searched and considered by the patent office? I'm sure it won't come as any shock to you that there are a lot of patents out there that get issued without properly being examined. And that's what many of my colleagues in IP litigation spend a lot of their time on, is shooting down patents that were not really proper or don't have what we call valid claims. And then the other thing they're interested in is, have you checked out other people's patents to make sure that what you're doing is going to be free of their claims? So this is something that it's always the twin peers. How strong are your own claims, and then are you free of third-party patents? Particularly, usually it's going to be your closest competitors who are patenting in the same area, and do they have claims that could possibly create an issue for you? Okay. So overall, your patent strategy, from the business perspective, you're going to want to make sure you're covering your current commercial product. You may have heard, somebody heard of the picket fence strategy for patenting? You want to basically set up pickets that are kind of your mainstays, your main coverage around your inventions, and then maybe connect them with patents that are, if you have the budget, connect them with patents and patent claims that are less, maybe less core, less critical or less essential, but are still can create value by creating more of a wall against a competitor. Again, costs are always going to be an issue in developing your strategy. You want to be watching what your closest competitors are doing in terms of their own patent filings. And patent applications are now published 18 months after they are first filed. So it's easy to go on. There are a number of ways that you can search with free online searching to check what competitors are doing. And I think I mentioned you want to be thinking ahead to how your invention might be changing and evolving, developing over the coming years. And in any way that is foreseeable, you want to try and capture that in your patent application as well, and your claims. And be thinking about what your current and future geographical markets will be and what your foreign filing strategy will be. I think really, this is kind of reiterating a lot of the things that I've mentioned already. You want to identify and evaluate your inventions as soon as possible in the process, because the earlier you figure out what you want to be patenting, the better off you will be in terms of assessing when it should be filed and how it's going to stack up against what's already out there. The longer the time goes on, the more there's an opportunity for somebody else to come in and create prior art against you that's going to make it more difficult for you to get your own patent. So it's good, whatever endeavor you're in, whether it's just your own thing or your company or whatever it is, be looking for ways to continually evaluate the invention disclosures and the possibilities for patenting that are out there. Evaluate patentability of those disclosures and file applications often and early. Even if you have a low budget, you want to be really thinking critically about where and when we should be filing patent applications, because once certain dates go by, you're just going to be plumb out of luck. So it's just good to have some kind of a system for evaluating the IP on an ongoing, regular basis. And it's really just kind of regularly assessing your position, monitoring competitors, regularly assessing your own portfolio and how it stacks up against your evolving invention developments. Those are all things that, kind of the companies that have the most sophisticated and effective IP strategies, that's what they're doing. And I think that is it. So anybody have any questions?
We have 10 minutes for questions, so
I mean, I can blather on and on about the examination process, about fun times with the USPTO and the interference process. Some of you may know about the big CRISPR interference. Did you have a question? Yeah. Yeah, sure. Okay.
Sorry.
Here, maybe.
No, she's going to need, or you can
Okay.
just put
Yeah.
the microphone in her face.
Can you do that? Okay.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
They won't see you.
All right, that's good enough for me. So my question is about modifying like biomarkers and peptides and stuff. Wouldn't that encourage if modifying them allows them to patent it? Wouldn't that encourage people to modify them to points just to patent them and then sell it? Or
No, that was very good, very well put, and a good question. So, so one thing to remember is that patenting is expensive. So, I think most people are not going to go into it lightly. But if there is a good reason for modifying them in a way that might be commercially advantageous, there has to be motivation. But then you can. What I didn't really maybe explain completely is that you can. Once you modify a peptide or protein or some otherwise naturally occurring molecule like that, that renders it patent eligible subject matter, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is patentable in the sense that it passes the other standards that are required in terms of novelty, non-obviousness, and so on. So it would have to be a change that is both new and not obvious, and if it's a small change, a very small change, the office is likely to come back and say that it's obvious, because we all know that point mutations and things like that are easy to do and routinely done. So you'd have to have an argument that the small change was not kind of a foreseeable thing to do, and that it has some kind of effect that produces surprising and unexpected results with it, in order to get over that non-obviousness hurdle. Yes, ma'am. Here, we'll do it this way. I think it'd be more interesting for the people on the tape to hear different voices anyway.
So just as a continuation of that question, if you were to make a small modification to some sort of peptide or something like that, that you had a previous patent on, would a continuation patent be applicable in that case then?
That's also a really good question. So this gets into a whole area of how your own previous application may or may not be prior art against you. And so we do spend a lot of time with clients trying to figure out what the right strategy is with a new development based on, that is on their pre-existing invention. And there is no one answer. Typically what we do is we evaluate that development for how patentable it is on its own. Like if you didn't have, if you had to work against yourself, you have to worry about your prior art, your own prior art against you. Can we make this a standalone application? Are we patentable over our own? And if we can do that, we prefer to do it that way. And the reason is, while there is a mechanism in the US to avoid having your own previous similar application work against you, it's called a continuation in part application, where you kind of supplement your previous. It is not advantageous for a couple of reasons. One, it's going to take away from your patent term on the second one, because your patent term is going to be once you claim that priority, once you hook those two together in that process, the effective filing date for you is the filing date of the first application, not the second, in terms of calculating the term. And so you usually are going to lose like at least 5 or 6 years off the term right off the bat. So we try to avoid that if we can. But if you can't avoid it, then we'll sometimes file a CIP if we think it's worth doing that. But sometimes the claims, if we're doing our job, then right, as patent attorneys, then hopefully we have provided broad enough claims in the first application that even though we didn't have the second, the later development captured literally, our claims are broad enough that they're sort of cast an umbrella, a big enough umbrella to capture those in a way that we think is, that will work to keep others out. So there's a lot that goes into that question. Very good question, and it happens all the time that we have to figure that out.
Grant Kruger, University of Michigan. I've noticed online there's some websites which allow you to file a provisional patent in 24 hours. Can you comment a little bit on those services, how they're different to working with a company like yourself?
Yeah, so if you have an emergency situation and you need to feel like get a provisional application filed because something got disclosed and you need, then okay, all right, but so a provisional application, I don't, you're going to get the answer you expect from me, right? I operate exclusively in this area, and your provisional application is only going to be as good as the comprehensiveness of the disclosure that you provide. So it used to be because we changed from a first to file, from a first to invent system to a first to a file system, that having what we call just a paperclip provisional, where you basically just gather up your slides and whatever and throw them into a document and file, that was fairly effective. But now we are a first to file system, and so you're just like the rest of the world, and so your disclosure is the thing that is kind of set in stone at the provisional stage your effective filing date. So if you haven't worked with a patent professional who can help you work out what kind of claims you think you might like and will be valuable to you, and then have correspondingly complete and comprehensive disclosure in your patent application, then your provisional won't really be worth anything. So that's why. No. You can certainly add, and I did allude to that in the time between filing a provisional application and the non-provisional application. You can add as much as you like, but when it comes to evaluating the claims and the effective filing date of your claims, the examiner is going to go and look and compare when did you actually support this claim? When did you provide all the necessary description that I can give you, that I can say to you, you're entitled to that claim as of this date? So they will go back and look at the provisional and see, well, what did you disclose here and what are you doing here? And that, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the patent war in the CRISPR genome editing space, but that the comparative level of disclosure in the different parties, what they were disclosing and when became a really critical kind of part of that whole. It was a slightly different context, but the same general principle of when did you file your description and when. So.
Thanks for the talk. So, aside from publishing too much, what are some common mistakes that you see from companies coming out of academic labs?
Okay. Number one at the top of that list is attempting to name as inventors people who are not, from a legal perspective, inventors, because most people in academic labs are used to kind of the way it works in terms of peer-reviewed journal articles and naming authors on a paper. And it's very different. You can't do it that way. Being an inventor on a patent is a legal determination, and there may be many people who contributed in ways to an invention that don't satisfy the legal criterion to be an inventor, but they made a major contribution. There are other ways of compensating them for their contribution, but improperly naming inventors as inventors or improperly leaving people out who are supposed to be inventors can end up in invalidating your patent. So you definitely want to have, and the way inventorship is determined, it depends, again, we're back to the claims. So it's all about the claims. And there's a particular legal standard for the kind of contribution that each person involved may have made to at least one claim on the application. So that would be kind of mistake number one. Mistake number two is when we get initial disclosures, a lot of times the people at universities or tech transfer offices are tight on budget, and the other thing is they wait until the last possible moment. So we're getting stuff at the last minute, and they'll send us a disclosure and like, can you just file this? And what we have to do is go in and take out, hopefully we have time to do this, but again, in the academic context, typically you're writing, you're thinking about, for example, a peer-reviewed journal article, you're paving the way, you're showing at the beginning of your article all sort of the steps in the past that have led up to this point, because you're trying to support how utterly rational and reasonable and how all this ties together, which is exactly the opposite thing you want to do in a patent application, because you want the examiner to read your application and go, man, this was like an unbelievable, flash of genius that you put all this together. So it's that, in that sense, I'd summarize that mistake as waiting till the last minute and relying on kind of an academic approach to explaining the invention. We can't, we don't want to do it that way in our world. You'll end up creating your own, essentially the argument for the examiner about why your invention is obvious. So, I don't know if there'd be, those are the two, two big ones. Okay.
One more question and then we have.
What are the other ways of compensating the people who have done the work but they are not they have done a significant
Right. So the question, right. So the question was, what are other ways of compensating individuals who may have contributed in an important way to an invention but don't qualify as an inventor from the legal standard? And so that is, usually it's a contractual arrangement. So when people say, look, you would not have been able to actually put all this together without, all the hours that I put in, running gels or whatever. And this is a kind of a frequent occurrence, that there's somebody who's put in a lot of man hours or woman hours, and but they don't qualify as an inventor because they were basically being told what to do at the instruction of one of the people who qualifies as an inventor, and they were basically just acting as a technician, just hands. So that person could rightly say, look, you would not be here without, so that would be their leverage, and you can have some sort of just a contractual arrangement where you say, you get, this person gets X amount of money out of whatever, let's say, licensing fees we get for this, or something along those lines. But it would be a separate contractual arrangement with that person who presumably has some amount of leverage for saying, you need to think of me here and what I contributed. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's thank Great. Okay, the next person that we have speaking is Dawn Norman.
This portion is really what that is that next step. You have a technology that you've developed, and it may or may not be patentable. It may or may not be unique. You may have competitors out there, and you're a Me Too product. And so the regulatory process for FDA is slightly different than IP. And what we're going to talk about today are strictly about medical devices, tissues, and biologics that are regulated as medical devices. We're not going to talk about pharma. And so it's something where, this is going to kind of walk you through the process of how do I know when I have a medical device? What is it whenever I have to be regulated by FDA? What do I need to do strategically, and what know-how do I need to have? So, and this is all information that you can actually access publicly. And honestly, regulatory affairs is nothing but a puzzle. It's a puzzle of the regulations, technology, and business. So what you'll see is a lot of people in medical devices have a technical background. Like I have a molecular physiology background, but it's something where I don't have to be an engineer for this. You have to have business savvy to understand strategy. We do have plenty of people who are JDs in our world, but many aren't. So it's something where this is not a world where you have to have a professional degree for it. It's something where you typically will gravitate into it because you like putting puzzles together, in all honesty. So we're going to use a lot of words that are similar to hers in the sense of IP, but they mean different things. And so that's one of the first things that we get into as we'll go through, and I'll explain some differences. So quickly, I just want to talk briefly about the history of medical devices in the US. In 1938, FDA really charged that some devices could be defective, unsafe, unhealthy, and so they really started to say, we now have medical devices. They coined the term, but they didn't require any submission. They didn't require approval. They just said, here's what a device is. And then in 1962, really drugs had started being able to come through FDA, but this is something where thalidomide was approved in Europe, but there was an FDA reviewer who said, no, I don't have enough data yet. I don't have enough data yet. And by the time that she was able to get enough data on that, then data came out in Europe that it was actually causing congenital birth defects. And it's one of the landmark examples of FDA requesting more and more data to prove a product was safe and effective. And so even though we're not talking about drugs, it's a critical landmark. So come 1976, they institute the Medical Device Amendment. And this is whenever FDA said, okay, you guys have claimed that all of you are medical devices. We're going to finally make a catalog of this is what medical devices are, and we're going to start organizing them. And we're going to start tracking them. Part of this was because of pacemaker failures. Can you imagine pacemakers not being controlled, right? Dalcon Shield IUDs, lots of injuries because of that, and we can go on and on. And then in 1990, we had the Safe Medical Devices Act, where this is where hospitals and nursing homes could finally actually report that adverse events were happening in the field. Because until then, it was just relying on the medical device manufacturer to tell the FDA that something bad happened. And trust me, they go through flowcharts to determine if something is reportable or not. And so in the effort of transparency and safety for the public, then hospitals and general health care providers could log this in for us. And it allowed for recalls of devices. All right, 2002, MDUFMA, we start paying for submissions. now. And can you imagine all the work that had been done in the 80s and 90s, and really nobody paid for this? You paid an annual fee. Congress took care of it. So there are fees now for submissions, and we'll talk a little bit about that pricing, and some are cheap and some aren't. All right, so we're gonna just say, where do you start? So my job is opposite of hers. My job is to show you that, or to show FDA that your device is basically as similar as possible as someone else's. Even though you have a novel and unique parameter or claim, as she calls it, you have a unique claim, but my job is to take everything about yours that isn't unique and tell a story and wrap around that to say, well, how do we get you through FDA the most quickly, most cost-effective, and yet in a safe and effective manner, okay? So first you gotta start off, what's my product? Is it a drug? Is it a device? Is it software? Is it a cosmetic? Is the cosmetic a device? Is it a tissue? Is it a biologic? There are tons of things out there that look like drugs because it's injectable and it's regulated as a device. Softwares that are regulated as devices. Vaccines that are biologics whenever they used to be a drug. We go back and forth. So this is constantly changing. So then we'll say, what is my product? Then what's its intended use? That intended use is basically what her claim is. So what is it meant to do? Who's it going to be used on? And what do you want to say about that product as well? And we'll go through that. How's it regulated? We'll talk through this. And then the most important part from a strategic point and a budgeting point is what testing is required. Just because you have a product that is a medical device or a drug or whatever it is, FDA is going to require that you either have on file or that you submit data to them, either in a small package or a very extensive package, depending on the risk of the product, okay? All of that takes time and money. And as you go through and you get into industry, that is going to be, really one of the top things that someone will ask you for. What are all the things I have to do? How much is it going to cost me? How long is it going to take? When are we going to get to market? And of course, they want it sooner than later. So what's an intended use? All right, that's the general purpose of the device. Okay, it's its mechanism of action, its general function, and then it includes the indications for use. That's who are you going to use it on? What disease or condition are you going to use it? Indications for use could be the stabilization of fractures. Maybe it's the diagnosis of strep A for in vitro devices. But then we have something else called marketing and clinical claims. This is where our claims and our words of claims are different. These clinical claims could be, I perform better than my competitor. I have more sensitivity to this. So this is something where it could be clinically relevant, but if it's going to be about your competitor and call out nice percentages and that kind of stuff, you've got to have that clinical data on file. If it's an engineering differentiator, you've got to have that information on file. FDA does not approve clinical claims except for in class 3 products. But for most medical devices, they don't approve clinical claims or clear them. So we've talked a little bit about, is it really a device? So really here we've got that it's an instrument, an apparatus, an implement, machine, contrivance, implant, IVD, or any other similar related article that is intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, in the cure, mitigation. Mitigation is a big word that gets us to medical devices frequently. Treatment, prevention of diseases, and it doesn't achieve its primary intended use through chemical action. So that's something where there are things that become what we think typically look like a drug, but because their mechanism of action is actually more mechanical, like hyaluronic acid, it becomes regulated as a drug or as a device. So once we know that we have a product that's going to be regulated as a device, you can go through and search FDA's classification databases for product code, other 510Ks, which is a regulatory clearance for Class 2 products, and even establishment registrations, looking at your competitors to see what they do. You guys will get these slides and whatnot and have all these links, but this is research that you can do on your own through any projects that you have or when you go to industry. So all of U.S. regulatory submissions are risk-based. It goes from high to, from low, medium, high. Anything that's a higher risk, it's a harder submission. So we've got 3 major classifications. Class 1, typically, there are some special cases. There's no pre-market notification needed. IVDs, though, which is an in vitro diagnostic, it can oftentimes require a 510K, even though it's considered a Class 1 device. Class 2 devices, a 510K typically is needed, which is a pre-market notification to FDA where you submit your drawings, your basic mechanism of action, some testing information that we'll talk about more. For more simple devices that are still Class 2, FDA is starting just now to not down-regulate them, but provide provision that they are not requiring 510Ks. But you still have to have all that data on file at the company for inspection. And inspection happens every 3 to 5 years. Class 3, this is whenever a PMA application is required, which is a much more intense application to FDA, requires a good amount of time and money. So last, you're going to go through and evaluate consensus standards, guidance documents, and various testing standards. FDA sometimes, not all the times, tells you and gives you a nice outline about what testing standards you have to do. But a lot of times they don't. So what we do is we go back and we look at other products that are similar, and if they are a Class 2 device or a Class 3 device, there is public information on each that summarize the testing that was done. If it's a really old device, the summary of testing information is not all that complete. But more and more in the past 5 to 7 years, FDA has been requiring that we publicly disclose more information about the testing that we are compliant to. So we'll just run through a quick example, right? So we've got a fabulous fibula fixer, and it's a bone plate to be implanted in devices that, or in patients who've had a fracture of the fibula. So it's very similar to something else that's already on the market. This is probably not patentable. Plates have been on the market for a really, really long time. But there may be a space in the marketplace and a unique design or a competitive design that is a differentiator that may be worthwhile, and so you want to enter the market with that. So is it a device? Yes. It's because it's here for the treatment of a disease, and that disease is actually fractures. It doesn't mean that it has to be a disease pathway, but it could be a trauma, an event, something like that. So what's the regulatory pathway? We would go out and do a search for similar products because we know it is a Me Too device. And I'm just gonna, we've got examples that you guys can see here, but we know Synthes is a major competitor. We're gonna look up fibula, let's see what they've got on the market. They've got a couple of different fibula plates. Here are the 510K clearances and the numbers. This is all on the FDA website. And we can go and look to see what did they do in the past. What sizes do they have approval for? What's the metal that they're using? Is there a special coating? Or they may or may not talk about. So the other thing we go and look at is we look at what's the product code and the regulation that it sits under. So I think we've got a close-up here. Nope. So for this one, it's important that we know the product code. We always, whenever you list a product with FDA, you're going to have to know that backwards and forwards, along with the regulation summary, or the regulation, and that summary at the bottom is what's going to give you that extra information to know. Okay, so we're going to go through, and you saw that we looked at that product code of HRS. Whenever I go to the guidance or to the product code itself, it gives me a complete list of recognized consensus guidances that we've got to evaluate and see if we need to comply to. And there's probably 12 bullet points there, just for a metal plate, that you need to know if you have to comply with or not. So you've got to do some research. And these are just examples of the regulations. And, and we're going to go through another example here in a second. Here's where it calls out class 2, and here are the testing standards that are bigger. All right, so in guidance documents, where I showed you that product code, that was just what they called out for just that one product code. Because we know that there's more, we also need to understand if there's other ones that are required, and that's where you need to do general searches as well. Don't just plan on saying, hey, this is a HRS plate. What else do you need to look at? So that was our quick example, but we want to talk about general classifications. And so I think my slides got moved around a little bit. But, yeah. So we talked about class 1, class 2, class 3. In the US, we've got class 1 exempt, 2 and 3 EUs. They kind of line up similarly. 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. Canada has a 1 through 4 program, and on and on and on. These all pretty much are based on risk. So the 2As and 2Bs can be very delineating between sterility sometimes, or software, just depends. No. Okay. So the other question is what if you can't figure out the classification? What if you you think you're unique enough by intended use or technology, but you don't think that you're a class 3 product where it's a high risk device? That's where we can go and we can talk to FDA. We can ask for a request for designation and have a conversation with them and say, what do you guys think? The thing about this is that it's binding, so whatever they say goes, and that there's no room for negotiation. So you have to be very careful with these, in the sense that that if you have a strategy as far as a submission strategy of wanting to be being a class 2 versus a class 3, then you definitely want to be cautious in this zone. There's also something that is relatively new in the just in the last decade or so called de novo classification, and this is where you can approach FDA and tell them that I have a product that doesn't match any of the product codes, and it is not a high risk device. I don't want to go through these higher risk hurdles. And you have a conversation with them and present them a lot of data, and they will work with you to down classify basically from a class 3 to a class 2 if they think and agree that this is basically a medium risk device. So I do want to talk about regulations in general, and I know that this says frozen cherry pie, but it's something where this is the FDA for you. They can be very, very specific on intended uses. And here, a frozen cherry pie can be a maximum diameter of 4 inches. The word frozen can be omitted, but such omission can't be misleading. And this is really, really detailed for just a cherry pie. But here we have a manual toothbrush. So every morning, whenever you brush your teeth and with floss, that is a medical device that you are using. so are Q-tips, so are tongue depressors, the gloves at the doctor's office, cotton swabs, they are all medical devices. So here, you know, it's a very simple description of, you know, what a toothbrush is. And then we get into something more complex, cardiovascular, intravascular filters. You know, this is something that's being placed into the inferior vena cava. And what's in, you know, it's implantable, certain, you know, has a very complex way to be placed. Definitely has some significant risk to it. It's only a class 2 product though. It only requires a 510K. And whereas a pacemaker is a class 3 product. So it's something where it's very important that as you go through these regulations, that you pay attention to what the intended uses are, really, you know, what is the complexity around this, and know that you know, sometimes it could be a lower classification than you think. There are things that are called custom devices, and custom devices means that it is truly a one-off. This is not patient matching. Patient matching is whenever you take a scan of a person and everybody wants to 3D print something these days. That's a patient match device. Custom devices are something that is truly made for one single person in the universe, and it's just this one time that it's going to be made. It's not 3D printing, so just so everybody knows that. All right, so let's talk about the application process. If you have a class 1 product, about 70-something% of the medical devices overall are class 1 products, actually. They do not require a submission to FDA. But you have to register with FDA, you have to list with FDA, and as a medical device company, you're gonna have to have general controls of what they call a quality system. So getting through FDA is one thing, with the strategy and the submissions and figuring out how to do this. But living and breathing in a medical device company is completely separate. So even if you have a simple medical device that is a class 1, you still have to operate as a medical device company and work underneath a quality system and have plenty of files on site for inspection by FDA. You still have to require with adverse event reporting, with labeling requirements. Labeling includes websites. And so it's all of these different and all your marketing materials, so everybody knows. It's not just, oh, I have this device and I list it with FDA and off I go. There are still requirements for you, even if you have a simple device. So let's say you have a more complex device, and we know it's going to be class 2. But we have questions around the testing. There is a process called pre-submission. It used to be called pre-IDE, where we could only go and talk to FDA actually about the clinical studies. But now they've opened it up for all the submission types, which is nice. So if you're not class 1 and you have questions about what you need to present to them in a class, in a 510K or a PMA, you can go talk to FDA. So there's not a user fee for it. It's very convenient, but it does take some time. So it's something where know that that's that option. Once you have your plan and you've got your data collected, and if you're a class 2 device, it's a traditional 510K for your very first 510K. There's something called a 90-day active review time. That active time is the time that it's live sitting on their desk. It doesn't mean that the day that you submit and then 90 days later you get your 510K clearance. That's not the way it works. It means that you submit, and once they acknowledge it and accept the 510K and they say, you've got all your data here that we need, we start a clock. And then they look at it for about 60 days. At day 60-ish, they'll stop the clock and they'll send you a list of questions. And then they give you about 180 days to respond to those questions. Those questions could be very simple. They could be very complex. It depends on how well you wrote your 510K. And that's where strategy comes in, as far as knowing what your predicates are, what are the similar devices that you need to that you've presented and told them that you're similar to? What kind of testing did you present and give to them? How well did you write? Strangely enough, they will kick back things saying that you've misspelled things or that it wasn't organized or that it doesn't have a table of contents. So be a good writer because they will kick it back to you. And once you answer those questions and you send it back, then they start back on day 61. So that 90-day review time is the time that it's active on their desk. So as you're doing planning, do not think that your project plan says 90 days is a 510K. Usually, it takes about 6 months if you've done a good job. It will take much longer if you haven't. So, and FDA actually promotes or they publish the amount of time of their average review cycles. And so, and right now they're publishing about 5 months, but they haven't included what we call an RTA period either in that. So it's about 6. So I talked about being similar to something. This is where the point of a 510K is to be substantially equivalent to another device that is basically pre-amendment from 1976. So the device must be safe and effective and substantially equivalent to the legally marketed device. This is where, while you have a unique component, that is what you patented, this is where I'm taking everything else and saying, but we're still substantially equivalent. It doesn't mean exactly the same. Substantially equivalent means, you know, similar enough, we'll say, that we can say that we're just as safe and effective as this other device that already exists. And if you happen to be safer and more effective, that's fantastic. But you have to be at least equal to, okay? Statistically equal to. So this is based on, this is substantial equivalence is based on intended use and also the technological characteristics or mechanism of action, all right? So this is where identifying that predicate device, something that's similar to you, this is where going through all the searches of the databases really helps you out to know that you've got a good predicate that you can compare yourself to. There are times whenever human clinical data are needed for Class 1 and Class 2 devices. It is very rare for human clinical data to be required. Maybe for Class 2, they might want some pilot data. So it's something where if you need human clinical data, you only need investigation. You will need an investigational device exemption. And for this one, it is a 30-day review time where once it's been accepted and at day 30, if they haven't communicated with you, you can actually start your clinical study. I wouldn't recommend that because at day 31, they can send you a hold if they haven't replied to you, but it is something where technically you can start. So it is something where in these studies, you capture clinical data to support safety and effectiveness. And you want to clearly design a protocol that is capturing data for both of these and will support this. The other thing is you want to make sure that things are statistically, have statistical sample sizes if you're doing pivotal studies and really having to support those that clinical intended use. If it's just a pilot study where you're just showing that, hey, it works and it's basically, basically safe, that's whenever you can work a deal out with FDA to say, I'm only going to do 20 or 50 patients, non-randomized or something like that. But again, these are all negotiations with FDA that you work out through the IDE process. So last is Class 3, PMA. This is for the highest risk devices. There are a variety of types of different submission types, but the first one is free. The second one costs you about $300,000 just for the submission alone. That's the FDA fee, let alone all the additional costs on an annual basis to supply updates to. So from a strategic point of view, there are Class 3s can be very expensive. And if you don't have a lot of money in funding, you want to try to work your way to Class 2. However, there is a competitive advantage to being Class 3 if you have a complex device and a higher risk device. Your competition can't piggyback off of you as a class 3 device and just say, well, I'm just as good, or I'm substantially as equivalent to your product if you had been a class 2 device. So with that, there is a strategy whenever you have novel devices of, do you want to be isolating in the market where you've made it a very hard hurdle for any competition to come up, because they're going to have to do the same clinical studies you had to do, they're going to have to do the same testing that you had to do, you know, and it will have taken you years to get through that process. Whereas if you either worked your way into a de novo, or you worked your way into a worked your way into a de novo, or worked your way to a class 2 overall, they can just piggyback off of you and say that they're substantially equivalent and submit some data. One slide on combination devices. There are plenty of devices that are combination devices, drug delivering stents or drug eluting stents. So it can be drug device, drug biologic, device biologic, and what will happen is that the different divisions of FDA will come together and they will say, listen, the primary mechanism of action is the stent, and it's meant to hold this open. So we're going to let the device division oversee the submission, but they're going to pull in folks from the drug side. There are plenty of other times whenever it flips, and it's actually the drug that is the primary mechanism of action of what's going on, so the drug side will oversee that. Okay. Testing considerations no matter what classification. Even if you were class 1, even if you don't submit to FDA, you need to understand this product is being used on or in people. Is it biocompatible? There, of course, is an ISO standard related to that. If it's an electrical product, you have to demonstrate both electrical safety and immunity, so you've got electrical safety and an EMC. If there is software or even firmware, there is a difference from FDA. You have to validate these things and understand what those differences are, and there are different levels of concern. So the higher the complexity of the software and its risk, then the more intense validation you're going to have to do. Human factors. Human factors is not ergonomics. Human factors is, can somebody be trained and follow your instructions adequately based on the training and the labeling of your user manual or instructions for use that you gave. So this is very important in the sense of anything that has a user interface, anything that is going home with the patient because the patient or a caregiver has to operate, or even certain things where if a nurse is having to do this and it's a new technology that they're not used to seeing. This is a newer requirement that has really come to a head in the last 5 to 7 years, and is a very hot topic for FDA. Of course, sterilization validation. If you have a sterile product, you have to present data to them to show that it is sterile, along with the packaging as well. So, a couple of things of, if you don't comply, what can happen, right? I just want to talk briefly about that. So, basically, if you are promoting your product for off-label use, for an intended use or claim that you did not have cleared or approved by FDA, FDA can cite you warning 483s and warning letters. And so basically this is pretty simple. Promotion on a website and a PowerPoint presentation of information that was outside the cleared 510K. So your website is the portal to FDA looking at your marketing information. It's very important that that you have everything on label and appropriate there. Just to give you some idea of fines, granted this is a drug, but they were illegally promoting drugs, again, for intended uses that hadn't been approved by FDA. Just a small fine of $2.3 billion. And, you know, some involvement of Department of Justice. You don't ever want to hear DOJ is in the building. It's not fun. Stryker, let's see. Not have obtained marketing approval or clearance, beginning to offer for sale. This is something where we plenty of times have someone who they're working on something that's almost to market. They're wanting to promote it. They're wanting to get investor information or get information out there, and it's just not approved. The other part here is notice that this is a custom cranial implant. So that's custom. Since it's custom, it goes through a different process to make sure the FDA knows about customs, and they were promoting them inappropriately. You also have to worry about what your physicians and your key opinion leaders and your consultants say about your product. Just because it's a clinician doesn't mean that he or she can say whatever they want about your product. They have to stay on label as well. And so this is a good example of just, so a doctor being sued by various groups and lawsuits going back and forth because he was saying the wrong thing about what a product could do. My favorite one is sales reps. So especially in the medical device world, sales reps will go out, and it is their job to interface with the clinicians, with the surgeons, and talk to them about what a product can do. They're educators. Oftentimes they're telling them how to do this. So in a single charge, he had a felony of misbranding of a medical device and faced up to 3 years and $250,000 fine as a single individual. And you can bet that his company did not back him up because he was operating as an individual, and they, of course, are not going to say that they told him that that was okay to say. So it is something where it's real, it happens. These are even older examples. There are plenty of newer examples as well, but it is something where you need to stay on label for what is cleared, what is approved, and this is something where it's very critical for your business. One of the things that Terry spoke about just and this isn't my space, but it's important that you understand what the next step is. We've got IP, we've got regulatory, and it's fantastic that you have a new and interesting technology. But in the medical device space, your next step, which would be a next presentation, is how are you going to get paid for it? We all have conversations about healthcare, and will my insurance cover something? Will it not cover something? Will Medicare pay for it? Medicare won't pay for it, so that means my health insurance won't pay for it. This is called reimbursement. So it's fantastic that you make something new, but if you're not going to get paid for it, you've got to figure out a strategy of how to get it through the Center for Medical Centers. So it's something where this is your next step. How does it fit into CPT codes, and how do you get paid for a procedure, or is it going to be paid, or is it going to be considered durable medical equipment that someone takes home maybe? These are all things that will be assessed. Does it get bundled? A lot of procedures. So just because I get an IV, they don't bill separately for the IV catheter and separately for the IV tubing and separately for the use of the infusion pump. That's just considered a procedure. So all of that cost got bundled. So what that means is whenever you have, when you have that reimbursement, you need to figure out for your pricing, where are you going to fit in that? So that way you may have something really novel that you want to get $10 a piece for, but if they're only getting reimbursed $12 for the bundle, I guarantee you the hospital's not going to want to spend $10 on your one component whenever they have to buy 5 other components for that bundle. So this is all consideration for your next step in marketing. All right, so we've got about 5 minutes for questions. Go ahead. So it's faster if you just ask me. Oh, okay.
So a strange situation, right? You have a colleague who's a doctor and you're working with them. They do research into, say, head scratching, and it can reduce stress and reduce heart attacks or something like that, right? They ask you to build them a device to automate the head scratching process to help them with their research. So now as an engineer, you have this device that's potentially, it's an exempt device, right? Because it's very similar to maybe a head massager, but you think it is. They don't care about commercializing it, but you want to maybe just sell it on Amazon to different people. As an exempt device for this sort of thing, I mean, what sort of process would you go through to be able to make sure that you weren't going to get arrested or something like that?
All right. So my first thing would be, is it really a medical device, right? If it's a head scratcher. And so is it a general wellness device? And this is where we get into Fitbits and Apple iWatch. And we'll see. I want to see. So it's something where, so for a long time, wellness devices in general, if you are claiming, basically it makes you feel better, generally may reduce stress, or give you comfort, then it is something where a lot of times that it fits in a gray zone of wellness devices. FDA has basically said that there's it's enforceable if they want, and then that it's called enforcement discretion, so it's up to them, okay? So if your head scratcher, though, helps reduce heart attacks, you're now a medical device, okay? Don't claim it, right? And so it's something where there's that fine line between a commercial product and a medical device. Now, there may still be requirements for you as well as a commercial product, where I talked about the testing that you have to do as far as electronics. There are consumer standards that you may have to abide by as well. So if you're on that consumer side, make sure you're doing the research to understand what you need to do for consumer safety as well. But as soon as you move over to that claim, such as ECG function, you are now a medical device. FDA thus far has been saying Fitbits, et cetera. They are, they're not manipulating data. They're not telling you anything. It just gave you the heart rate. And they've been very soft and quiet on that. But as soon as we interpreted it into a waveform, it's now a medical device. Okay. Should you approach the FDA? I would talk to a regulatory consultant and talk about and really get some understanding as far as what you think is a claim or an intended use versus not. We can help you work through that strategy. There are plenty of devices where I've actually told somebody, if you say this, you're not a medical device, go sell it at Target or Best Buy or wherever, get some money in your pocket, and then work to have the medical data to support that secondary, additional, and truly medical claim that you want to have, such as reduction of heart attack or whatever. Other questions? Okay.
I know this might fall a little bit more under a definition or something along those lines, but what about some devices that perhaps help surgeons or physicians? They use patient data and they affect surgeons' decisions, perhaps like preoperatively. And since they're using patient data and affecting their decisions, but they don't make any particular contact with patients directly, where does that fall? That seems kind of like a gray zone to me.
It is a gray zone. So I think the question is so it's a software, right? And whenever you take patient data and you present, it's all about what's the channel as far as the presentation back to the physician. So if you just collected software from the patient's electronic medical record and you pulled it and you just presented it in a different table or format or chart, then you're not a medical device. There are guidances on how to interpret this. But let's say that you took that data and you compared it against databases or algorithms. You manipulated it and gave a prediction of they're likely to have this, they're likely to have that. You might want to prescribe this, you might want to do that. You're now in a medical device world. And FDA will want, they will want information about that algorithm. So you will have to provide FDA confidential information as far as what your algorithms are. They're not going to just say, you know, oh gosh, you have a proprietary algorithm. You're going to have to show it to them. They'll still keep it confidential, but you know, you're going to have to do that. And work through them to demonstrate that your prediction is the sensitivity and specificity is correct, or to what you claim. Other questions? No? Okay. All right, I think we've got it.
Thank you so much. Let's give another big round of applause for both speakers. I hope that was informative. The word to the wise is it's complicated, and seek professional help whenever possible. So, which flies in the face of most academic labs, which is do it as cheaply as possible. But that might not always be to your best interest. So thank you very much for attending. I hope you have a great rest of the conference, and I'll be available here for a few minutes if you have further questions. And